right? And it fills in, it essentially gives us the practical guide, right, into how we embody the Quran, how we actualize the Quran, right? And something that's not understood very often, but it's very important, right, is that there's more than one source of the Sunnah, right? Like the Hadith is what you'll most often hear referred to as the Sunnah, right? You hear Sunnah and Hadith kind of used interchangeably, right? And the Hadith is extremely important source of the Sunnah, an extremely important source of the Sunnah, and one could say it's the main source of the Sunnah, but it's not the exclusive source of the Sunnah, right? And this is a topic that we'll discuss later on, right? But that the important thing to understand from this, right, is that the Sunnah expands, clarifies, elucidates the Quran, right? And the Hadith is a major source of the Sunnah, but it's not the exclusive source of the Sunnah. Okay? And so what are the Hadith, right? Hadith, the word Hadith means like narration, right? And so a Hadith is the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, and they can be his own words. They can be, in some cases, words from God that the Prophet ﷺ is telling us, right, but that aren't considered the Quran. And they can be just about the Prophet ﷺ, right? They can be, narrations about the Prophet ﷺ where they're not, it's not something that he said, right, but it's maybe something that he did, right, or something that was his habit, right, or something that he didn't do, right, or a description of how he looks, or things like this, right? So it's not just sayings from the Prophet ﷺ, right? Sometimes they're interpretations of what the Prophet ﷺ said or did from the early generations, right? And sometimes they're just information about the Prophet ﷺ, right? And so the Hadith corpus, right, the collections of Hadith, right? So there's 6 major collections, right? And outside of that, there's many more extremely significant collections, right? Like, there's one collection that alone has 28,000 Hadith, right? Has 28,000 Hadith. And the person who composed this collection, right, had memorized or had collected 100,000 Hadith, or had collected 1,000,000 Hadith, had memorized 500,000 Hadith, right, and had whittled down from this, right, this collection, right, of what he deemed authentic. And it wasn't just his opinion of what he deemed authentic, right, but this is a huge topic, right, the authentication of Hadith, right, the Hadith collections. This is a huge topic that, again, inshallah, we'll cover at some point, but not right now, right? So what we need to know right now, right, is that Hadith are narrations from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and about the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, right, and about the early generations as well. And so something very important about the Hadith is that they're a massive collection of small details, right? They're a massive collection of very particular details, right? And putting the Hadith together, right, requires a lot of knowledge. It requires interpretations of learned scholars, right, pious communities, and methodologies, right, developed methodologies with how to arrange all of this raw data, right? So let's see if I can think of a good example for this.
So there's the 28,000 out of 1,000,000 example that you were giving earlier.
Right.
Those are what would be considered by that scholar as Sahih.
Right, exactly.
And there's 5 levels, and Sahih is considered the most evidenced and the most investigated, right?
Right. Yeah. But then even, I'll table that question a little bit, because this goes into, right, of this particular collection I'm mentioning is the Musnad of Imam Hanbal, right? And the Musnad of Imam Hanbal, although extremely reliable, does not contain only Sahih hadiths, right? And
Okay.
also the 6 collections do not contain only Sahih hadiths, right? And Sahih meaning like 100%
For sure.
authenticated,
Yeah.
right? There are other classes of hadith that are completely acceptable, even though they don't have technical classification of Sahih, right? But this goes into a whole world of hadith methodology. But this is an important point, right? Because sometimes you'll hear people say as if like Sahih is like the only thing, right? If it's not Sahih, it's not authentic, you don't have to listen to it, right? When this is not correct. This is not how the hadith scholars have used hadith in the past, right? It's not this black and white, right? There are other classes of hadith that are very important and valuable that would meet that technical classification, right? But like an example, right, would be, there's not one, but there's multiple hadiths, right? That one should not drink water standing up, right? Multiple hadiths that say that one should not drink water standing up. And some of these hadiths are quite severe, right? If I can recall, right, one of these says, like if you drink water standing up, like throw it up, right? But then some of us also might know, right, that there's a hadith narrated from Adi, right, radiallahu anhu, may God be pleased with him, where Adi was drinking water standing up outside of the mosque, right? And people were looking at him, right? Because obviously it was his practice to drink sitting, standing down, right? Regularly, this was preferred, right? But they see him doing this, and he says, I saw. If you see me doing this, I'm doing it because I saw the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, do this, right? So this is just an example, right, of that. If you're wandering through the hadith, right, and you come into this. You come into contact with these 2 hadiths, right? One that very strongly censors someone for standing up, drinking water, right? And one that says that it's no problem, right? It's agreed upon now that it's no problem to drink water standing up, right? But the point here isn't if you can drink water standing up or sitting down, right? The point is that there's a lot of small pieces of data that need to be assembled, and there's got to be a methodology on how to do that, and you have to have a lot of knowledge of a lot of reports, right? And the reason I'm spending a little more time on this than I possibly should, and going a little more into depth of it than I would like to at this stage, is that it's very common for people to think that the hadith is a text for the layperson, right? That like people should just get a big collection of hadith and read the hadith, and now you like understand Islam, right? Which the hadith have a lot of invaluable information. They also have a lot of difficult information, and you need someone smarter than you and with more learning than you to help you understand these books, right? If you're reading the hadith, attempting to come out with very clear understanding, you're not going to be able to do that. But if you're reading the hadith to see what the hadith are about, to get a sense of the sunnah, right? There's one should just be cautious of what people at an elementary level of understanding will be able to get out of the hadith, right? Of just reading, different collections. So, I'll pause for a second and see if is this all clear for everybody so far? Okay. So, now I'm going to mention the Sharia. Right, what's the Sharia, right? This is something, it's a big, word that we get thrown around all the time, right? Sharia law, right? People, Muslims, trying to impose Sharia law, or trying to live by Sharia law, right? So what is Sharia law? Sharia law, right? Sharia means like a path to water, right? This is the translation of Sharia, right? And what the Sharia is, right, is the divine law, right? It is the God-given law of Islam, right? Now, what does the Sharia consist of, right? The Sharia consists of essentially everything that a Muslim does, right, while trying to remain conscious of God, right? And this could be, like how you dress, right? This could be observing the prayers, right? This could be eating in a certain manner, sleeping in a certain manner, being kind to your neighbors, feeding the poor, right? All of these things are within the Sharia, right? And without going, so far in.
It's always thought to be like just the negative things.
Right.
I didn't know that there was it was all the positive things as well.
Right. It's all of the things, all of the things, right? And then it's actually quite heavily debated by very significant scholars, especially within the Hanbali madhab, right? And those words that I just said, if you've never heard them before, throw them out of your mind. We'll talk to that. We'll talk to that about that later on. Right?
Madhabs is more complicated. Yeah, that's for sure.
that's way past the intro class, right? Yeah. So there's so excuse me here, right? There's a group of scholars, right, who make a pretty convincing point that in general, right, in terms of political things in the Sharia, right, that there's sort of very little with this, besides just kind of general guidelines. Right,
to actually form a government.
Right, to have a government, right? What does a Sharia government look like, right? This really isn't an easy answer question.
As far as what my understanding of that is that a Sharia government would use Islamic jurisprudence, which is basically what Sharia is the law of customs, but literal laws of the land regarding crimes and how they're punished, as a form of government. So instead of politics, it's just law, which is the basis for politics too.
And so there's an element of that, right? But essentially the Sharia and its interaction with government and these kind of things is so complex, right? That for example, right, if you were a Muslim, right, say there's one Muslim who's in charge, right, and everybody else is Christian, right? There's not even one other Muslim who's in charge of, right? But he's like a dictator, right? Theoretical scenario. Right? He says, I'm going to rule by the Sharia. Right? For those who study the Sharia and they know the Sharia, right, they know that a part of the Sharia, ruling by the Sharia, is ruling in the best interest of the people who you govern. Right? Ruling in the best interest of the people who we govern. Right? So it would be imposing Islamic laws on those people. Right? On Christians, right, who are a part of a protected class of people. Right, if you go through the system, right, it's not this. It wouldn't work this way.
It has happened many times.
I mean, there have definitely been cases of it, right? But this is
But not in current times.
Right, and I mean the best examples, right, is within the past, and I mean this is as well getting way out of the scope, but because it's such a touchy question, right? I'm gonna address it a little bit more, right? Of essentially one of the most unique things about Islamic empire, right, the Islamic empire for most of its history, right, was that actually within the Sharia is a built-in legal pluralism, right, a legal pluralism, right, and this is something that people really don't understand right now, right, because now the current state model is a constitutional state, right, you write these are our values, this is our law, right, assuming that everybody can somehow rally around these sort of universal values. Right, which in itself, right, of saying, that all of these different people with different religions and different philosophies from different viewpoints are going to naturally abide by the same things is kind of a delusion. Right, but, put that aside, right, that's the constitutional state model, right, where the general Sharia model, right, was one of legal pluralism. Right, what does that mean? That means, right, Jews have some kind of general conflict, right, they go to a Jewish court.
Right.
Right, Christians have a conflict, they go to a Christian court. Right, Muslims who follow different schools of laws, right, go to schools of laws that reflect their values. Right, and this is actually one of the most successful things about the Islamic Empire, one of the most novel things about the Islamic Empire, and something that I really think helps debase this idea of what ruling by the Sharia is.
I know you got to move on, and I don't want to draw this out anymore, but two really important things that are protected under Sharia that should be mentioned, I think, is that under Sharia, other faiths are allowed to practice within a country that practices Sharia or a community that practices Sharia. Right. The old rule was that Christians and Jews had to pay taxes to continue to have a church or to continue to have a synagogue. the other thing that's even more important is that the Sharia guarantees in written form the first example of women's rights in the world. And it's still the exact same as it was 1400 years ago.
Hmm.
And so if anyone wants to dispute the role of women and how Sharia is a negative impact when they're talking about people getting stoned or anything like this, which are real common stories that get thrown around, Sharia protects women. And the known cases of adultery that would end in murder or death by execution are so small because there has to be 4 witnesses of that.
Right.
And that's
it's
Sharia law.
Yeah.
5
four,
witnesses.
and on top of that, pious eyewitnesses.
Okay.
Right. Like they also must be witnesses of a reputable character.
Right.
Right. So I mean, yeah, there's you know, those points are all valid and definitely things that, you know, again, inshallah, we will cover in, you know, a lot more painstaking detail in further classes. But I will clarify something about the tax for Jews and Christians, right? This is called the jizya,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this is, it's not a tax for them to practice their religion, it's a military tax, right? And what I mean by military tax is that the Muslims of the state are obliged to defend the state, including the non-Muslim inhabitants of it, right? They're obliged to do that, and as a result of that, the protected people pay a tax.
I thought it
Right.
was for the building, basically.
No,
like
they
property tax.
They pay the tax for the military service, and if
Okay.
they enlist in the military, according to some scholars, this tax goes away.
Waived. Okay.
Right.
My
So
mistake.
it's clearly a matter of you know, protection, right, and the expenditure of resources to defend the people who have technically no obligation of the defense to the state or anything like that, with the exception of paying a reasonable tax. Right, so, you know, essentially, like, something that also should be mentioned about Sharia, right, is that Sharia, right, is, right, like, Sharia in its essence, right, is talking about a perfect divine law. It's talking about a perfect divine law, right? And now this is really important in relation of what I'm about to say, right? What I'm about to introduce is called fiqh, right? And fiqh is like understanding, right? And most of what, when we talk about the Sharia, right, like what we just mentioned right here of like it's a tax of this, it's a tax of that, right? That's like a little example of fiqh right there,
Mm.
right? That's us, right? We have these building blocks, right? We have the Quran, we have the Sunnah, right? We have this information, right? And we have some clear things, right, that we know that we have to do, right? Some of them are very explicitly clear, right? We don't have to question about them or use very little fiqh to try to understand them, right? But some of them are a little trickier, right? Like, for example, right, what is the role of Islam in politics, right? Something like this, right? This requires fiqh, right? And fiqh is essentially, it's done through something called ijtihad, right? That's not on here, right? But it's not super important at this stage, right? What ijtihad means is essentially like struggling, right? Like a struggle to try to understand something in this scenario, right? So fiqh, right? Like when you open a book of Sharia, right, and read the rulings, what you're reading is fiqh. What you're reading is people's best attempt to understand as close as possible to that divine law what it could be, right? And another very interesting fact about our religion is that there's very few sectarian differences, right? Like, I mean, you know, there is like a Sunni Shia split, right? And this is, you know, as well someone, right? But, you know, you've maybe heard these names, right? But in general, there's very few sectarian differences, but there is legal pluralism, right? There are people who follow different opinions within fiqh, right? Because fiqh is means understanding, right? And what it is it's people's best, most diligent, most sincere, you know, most devoted attempt at finding out how close, right? Like to making their best guess at what the Sharia is, right? And I mean, a guess isn't really fair to say, right? Because you have a lot of very clear indicators, right? But there's a little bit of room, right, that we have to struggle towards to get the exact specificity of it.
Like the basic. I always thought of fiqh was like the basic knowledge, like the basic way you should follow.
Right.
And then there's more. Is that the same?
Well, so fiqh encompasses all of it essentially, right? So like the basic way, right? But like there's some things, right, that like like that are so clear that like all the Muslims agree on.
Yeah.
Right, like prayer, right, and how the prayer is done, right. But then there's like a little detail in this prayer, right, of like, well, how do you move your finger when you're saying the last part? Right?
Yeah.
Right? Because there's a hadith, right, that said that the Prophet ﷺ would move his finger when making the tashahhud, right, the last part of the prayer, right? And you'll see one of the best examples of fiqh is if you look in the masjid and you see everybody when they're kneeling and they're praying. Some people are moving it real slow, some people are moving it really fast, some people point it once and put it down, right? There's all of this, right, of where we know that you're supposed to point your finger during the prayer. We know that, right? But how exactly?
How your parents taught you.
Right? Right, so that's... Right,
people that are born into it, that is it.
Exactly,
yeah.
right?
And if it's a convert, then it's the person who taught you.
Right.
Yeah.
Or it's just, it's probably Google.
But that's one of those little things that most people just don't really fight about too much.
Right. And so that's a lot of, right, the fiqh, but there are also some much bigger issues in fiqh, right? Like, for example, right, things of like, Islam, politics, right, all these kind of things. Right, so I mean, the fiqh is our best attempt at understanding the Sharia.
Does the fiqh and the sunnah kind of get interchanged a little bit?
Yeah, totally. Like the fiqh, like a lot of stuff gets interchanged with the fiqh. Right, people say this is the sunnah, right, and that's the fiqh. Right, it's an opinion out of possibly an array of opinions. Right, some of which might have a different answer. Right, and then.
So there's fiqh for certain different sects and certain different interpretations and everything. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Well, so essentially, like, differences in how Muslims do things is differences in fiqh.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I'm saying, is that we all actually follow the same Sharia, right? Even if we're doing it differently, right? Our differences come from the fiqh, right? Come from our attempt to understand the Sharia as best as possible.
But it's obligatory to accept like all different understandings of it as valid.
Right. Well,
that are done by the scholars, not just
right. Yeah. And I wouldn't say it's obligatory to accept them all, but one should have, at least a strong respect for the amount of insane effort that people have put into trying to understand.
If it's somewhat valid, yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. If it's through a solid methodology, right? Yeah. Some dude who just posts something on YouTube.
Your
with
foot should be measured this amount.
Exactly, with ambiguous credentials.
Well, and I just looked through. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
You had a question.
Yeah. So, how do you approach things when there is a very clear division in how people see fiqh? Like, you look at someone and you're like, that is very wrong.
What's the authentic? The most authentic.
Yeah. I'm not necessarily what's most authentic, but like, how do you deal with those differences when they're pretty extreme, like when one person says, oh, you need to do it this way, and the other is like the exact opposite, but they're both derived from their version of fiqh.
Right. So, I mean, there's the absolute simplest answer with this, right, is that if you're following something that you believe in your heart is sound and that has evidence, right, you're entitled to follow that, but if it's possible for you to just follow the majority when you're at least with the majority, just do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
right.
If your niyyah, it's your niyyah. So if your intention is good, and that was what you were taught, you're not doing anything wrong. So if somebody from Azerbaijan comes to mosque and they're praying very differently than you, first off, you don't know if they're Shia or if they're Sunni. And if this is the only place that they can come and pray with other people, then you don't want to push them away, even if there's some different sect than you. And this is, I think, fiqh and interpreting it and how you apply it around other people and what you say and what you don't say because of being polite, that is probably the biggest amount of discord that there is on a personal level between Muslim people that are not used to being around each other.
Totally. Like, this is huge, is that just, the little ways that people might correct each other, right? Realize that it's quite possible that both of these people are right.
And I would are we having a class on a later date about like Sharia law and
totally.
fiqh and stuff like
totally.
that?
We're like, I mean,
there's so many questions I have.
Yeah.
Sit here all night if you want.
I mean, honestly, like when I started this, I was like, oh man, we're gonna go through the prayer and everything today, and then I like started typing it up, and I was just like, Like we have
We'll
like
see
there's
how-
so
It's okay. We'll try and keep
there's
it to
so
the.
much to do.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, you know, I mean, so I mean, as of right now, right, it's like I'm just trying to get these fresh.
I liked what
definitions
you
in
said
there.
though about like it's really good to just do as the people are doing.
Right.
That's the best.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's definitely the best solution, right? Is like, you know, like I mean, if you go to like you know, a mosque in North Africa, right, and say, you know, everybody prays with their hands at their sides, right,
Yeah.
as some, you know, countries do, right, according to their fiqh, right? Like you don't want to go in there and be like, no, it's like this, like everybody, come on, you know, it's like
This is the biggest
You know?
arguments that happen. though.
Yeah,
It's true.
it is, you know,
It's
and so-
always happening.
And it's like even if you go home, you know, and you go home and you're like, whew, like thank God.
Yeah.
You know, because like you know, because you read the hadith and you're like, I need to be praying like this, right? Like that's fine, right? You could do that, right? But like in these situations, right? Then, you know, I mean, the Prophet ﷺ, right, advised us to stick to the way of the majority, right? And in these kind of ways, right? You know, it's always good to just be humble,
Yeah.
right? But also, you know, not to let yourself get kind of tread on, right? If you got something from a reliable source, right? You can be humble and accept what they offered you, right? Without also being like, oh, I've been doing this wrong the whole time, and you know, and like, and this person said it like this, like, oh, the religion's whole divided. This person's a wrong sect. No, it's different methodologies.
Yeah. In this mosque 10 years ago, I was taught how to pray the right way because I hadn't been around other Muslim people. And so one guy who was from Tajikistan taught me how I was supposed to put my hands before I went through each motion. And then I'm in Turkey, and nobody puts their hands up before they go and do anything else. And I noticed it right away so I just do it once, and then the rest of the time I don't do it because it's like, it doesn't make any difference.
Right.
It really doesn't. It's your mannerisms, and none of it's wrong. If I was in Tajikistan, everybody would be doing it the way Shahram Shamsov taught me how to do it, and that's fine. It doesn't make any difference.
Right, and the thing is that it's like, you know, with things like that, like it would make a difference if you know, if what you were describing wasn't the well-known view of the Hanafi madhab, right? The well-known view of the Hanafi madhab, right, is that you say, you know, right, and I just, you know, said, you know, some more advanced words again, right? But the well-known view of one of the legal schools, right, is you say Allahu Akbar and you go like that, right, and you don't do it again, right? Where the other schools go like that, right? So it's a strong opinion, you know, and I've been advised, you know, by many people that, you know, you can't, you know, you shouldn't mention madhabs, right? You shouldn't mention different schools and opinions, you know. But I mean, I think as we all see here, you know, it's like in America, right? When we come places as converts, right, we are immediately exposed to the diversity of schools of thought, whether we like it or not, right? And we often don't. We don't like it, right? And it's very confusing, right? Because you just read something on the internet and then you come and then you do it and someone's like, no, brother, you know?
The very first time I came to Juma here, everybody here had been to Juma before, and there was still a spirited argument about how many rakat should happen at Juma.
Yeah,
And
that's
how is that still going on?
and I mean, especially like, you know,
That's a new one for me.
like we're here in, you know, we're here in Missoula, Montana, you know, like what's the legal school of Missoula, Montana? Right.
You.
You know?
It's you.
I mean,
That's right.
yeah,
That's why we're all listening to you.
It's essentially right.
I'll tell you.
Whoever is in charge of the MSA house.
Yeah, it's
at
you.
the time, right?
This is new now. Hanbali boss.
I sure hope not.
No, it's not.
But yeah. So and we can, you know.
I'm gonna let you get through this first page without
No,
interrupting you again.
no,
I promise.
It's good. Honestly, as soon as